Smell or something.
Going live in 5, 4, 3.
Welcome everybody, to those of us who are in the room and those following online. My name is Max Harding, I'm the Chief Revenue Officer for OASIS. It's my pleasure to welcome you here today. I'll be facilitating today, but you'll be glad to know you won't be hearing too much from me and you will be hearing a lot from Tom and Ian on my left here. So just a little housekeeping for those of you both in the room and online before we get started. There's no fire alarm planned today and the fire exits are behind you. If you are online, we do invite you to submit your questions and we will be moderating those and asking Tom and Ian and David Reynolds, for that matter, to answer those questions later in the session. So why are we here today? Well, back to Tom and Ian, actually. We first met at an event earlier this year at IRMS, and we were intrigued by the concept of digital decarbonisation. And as an organisation which helps clients and organisations such as those in the room and online to bridge the divide between the digital and the physical, we wanted to explore it more in the context of information management, hence the white paper. We wanted to start working out and looking at how we can help clients to implement more sustainable practices in information management. And we do see opportunities for clients to reduce their digital carbon footprint through best practice. But we think that the message around the drivers for this needs to be clearer, hence the white paper. Our mission is to work with clients and organisations such as yourselves to support better decisions in their information management, and hence the white paper will be available for downloading from today on our website, oasisgroup.com. So, on to Tom and Ian. So, full biographies are available in the white paper, so I won't embarrass the guys too much, but just by way of introduction, Professor Tom Jackson is a leading academic in information and knowledge management at Loughborough Business School, known for pioneering Emotive.ai and the world's first data carbon forecasting toolkit. His work bridges AI, environmental sustainability, and information management. Professor Ian Hodgkinson is a strategy expert at Loughborough Business School and has made significant contributions to digital transformation and decarbonisation. His research on the interplay of data, learning, and sustainability is shaping the future of digital solutions, including his work on ethics for the UK's National Digital Twin programme. So that's it from me by way of introduction. Thank you again for your time here, and I shall hand over to Tom and to Ian to talk you through the white paper.
Thank you, Max. Good morning, everyone. Hope you're well. We're trying to make this as interactive as possible, so if you've got some questions, please just shout them out. And as they said online, if you can put them through and it come through. Liz, will you come with the questions? Or Noria? Great, thank you. So why are we here? I suppose we need to think about digital and the carbon footprint, right? And the stat I always love, you think about the footballer Ronaldo. If he sends out an Instagram post and it goes viral, you could power 10 homes for 1 year. 10 homes for 1 year from one Instagram post. So the thought that digital is carbon neutral is just not true. So that's what we want to try and explore over the next 30, 40 minutes, and hopefully you can interact along the way. We'll get there, I promise. So the agenda, we want to spend a little bit of time setting the scene so we're all on the same page, and then we're going to start looking at some of the issues like dark data, data waste, and how they impact organisations, and maybe what OASIS can do to help you with those challenges. Then look at other ways to look at reducing your digital carbon footprint, and then we're finished with some benefits and challenges.
So to set the scene for us today, when we think about traditional polluters, we'll often think about the vapour trails we see in the sky from aircraft. We'll often think about the plumes of smoke that we'll see across factories throughout the world. Obvious polluters, it's tangible, you can see what's going on. I'm sure many of us in this room have walked along a shoreline and we've seen the single-use throwaway plastic that gets washed ashore. you can see the waste. You can see the impact. It's tangible. When we started out on this journey with digital decarbonisation, we were shocked really to find that many organisations assumed that their digital practices are carbon neutral. And the big reason for that assumption is because you can't see it. It's intangible. Now imagine if you could see all the zeros and ones rising from your desktop, from your laptop, from your mobile device. If you could see it, suddenly people would begin to ask, wow, where does that go? What impact is that having? Can I minimize the amount that I'm creating? Does that benefit the environment? Throughout the last few years, we've made great strides in helping organizations to understand that actually how they engage with digital, their day-to-day digital practices, they have an environmental footprint. And that environmental footprint is growing. It is significant already, and it promises to be even more significant as we move forward. So how can we go about mitigating that negative impact?
So, oh, hello. Let's go back. So what's the total impact then of data centers? So if you think about the global footprint of data centers, it's at 3.7%. You think, well, what is that in real terms? So you think about then about aviation, and in terms of the greenhouse gases created from taking flights, that's at 2.4%. So we say it's bad to take a flight, but also we start thinking about our digital carbon footprint is also not looking so good either. And then we know by next year there'll be something generated in terms of 175 to 180 zettabytes of data. What does that look like? Well, it's the equivalent of one individual watching Netflix high definition for 6.8 billion years. So that's how much data is out there in the world. And you can get lost, can't you? You think of all that data, and that's why we're going to come on to data, dark data and data waste. So current terms, we're not going to meet our 2050 targets for many reasons, but also we've not really considered digital decarbonisation. The carbon actually comes from data activities. So we currently work with the OECD .ai 1 program, and it's really important that we do work with them because we've just fed into a policy document that will go to 39 countries around the world trying to get that notice. So it's a two-way thing in terms of top-down and bottom-up. So that goes out to 39 countries. Hopefully they adopt that in terms of their policy, and then it goes into regulation. We also work with the World Economic Forum in terms of, we've inputted into a white paper. Really important, that's going to be launched at Davos. So we're really trying to get the word out there that we need to start looking at our carbon footprint from digital.
So we're going to focus and zoom in a little bit on dark data and other data problem areas, because it's one thing to identify a problem and to shock and awe, but it's another thing to begin to think about how can we actually address this big issue, because ultimately it's dependent on yourselves to change practices. And the great thing is there's many things we can do differently, which actually has a huge benefit. So Tom mentioned that currently we, as a collective throughout the world, are falling short of the required trajectory to meet net zero by 2050. Presently, when we think about the contribution of digitalization and digital practices, the figure that typically does the rounds is that it accounts for around 4% of the total global greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. So relatively small currently when we think about other big polluters like, say, manufacturing. Having said that, current interventions clearly have not been enough to help ensure that the trajectory that we're on is sufficient. Okay? We argue that a big overlooked area is indeed digital data and the digital practices of organizations. So not only is it significant now, we have to understand it in relation to the future and what the future landscape looks like. So Tom mentioned that roughly the global amount of data creation sits at around 180 zettabytes. By 2035, that goes over 2,000 zettabytes. So we are amassing huge amounts of data. We are on the precipice of a tsunami, if you like, of data creation. So suddenly that 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, suddenly, looking forward, we absolutely expect that is going to increase dramatically. So we can see this tsunami approaching. If we don't do something about it now, it's going to be too late. What is fascinating is that when we think about those industry sectors who are going to be the biggest contributors to global data creation, what we're starting to see is the emergence of new sectors, new industries, like healthcare, as critical actors responsible for mitigating this type of growth. AI is going to play a huge role, and it's one of the big reasons as to why we're going to see this huge increase in global data creation. But if you think about IoT, Internet of Things, so IBM recently stated that data generated from IoT sensors, approximately 90% is never used. 90%. And that's coming in continuously. So whilst this is about global data creation moving forward, just imagine the amounts of data that's being hoarded so the effect can be multiplied. And this is the context that we're battling with and that we need to address as we move forward. So this gets us really thinking about how effective are organizations in optimizing the data that they're creating and the data that they're storing. Okay. Working quite closely with AWS, Amazon Web Services, we had a really nice case in point where 80% of on-prem primary business data was dark data and or rot data. So what is dark data? So dark data is information assets that are generated, that are created, might be used once, they might never be used at all. They become forgotten, yet remain in storage. So they're utilizing critical energy resources and yet have no value to the organization, in so much that it's fallen out of corporate memory. This is a big contributor to this notion of data waste. Rot data, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. We were working with a council a few years ago, and they were saying about how they still have their Christmas menus in storage from 10 years ago. And whilst that might seem quite trivial, imagine the cumulative impact of that. So what we're not very good at as organizations is getting a real grasp of, one, what data we're creating, but secondly, what do we have? What we found is this desire to store it all. Okay? And the question has been, how do we store it all? What we like to do is pivot that question to say, should we store it all? So when we think about the transition from physical records to digital records, for instance, there has been this desire to take all physical records and digitize it all. When you ask the question, why? Why do you want to digitize everything? Well, often organizations respond with, well, not sure really, we just thought that's the best way, that's the safest approach. What we really have been trying to encourage in that transition is recognition that dark data can exist within your physical records. Okay? You can forget what is actually being stored. So having a clear inventory of those physical records to then ask the questions, what do we need to digitize? Why do we need to digitize it? And what might be the best way to go about taking that physical record on its journey to becoming a digital record? Now, we've spoken a lot about the environmental costs and environmental impacts, which is super important and super critical to the planet. But there is absolutely a financial incentive also to pursuing this approach of digital decarbonisation. The key advantage being a benefit to the bottom line. Okay? Storing it all costs a heck of a lot of money. And there's just one illustration on the screen here. It would therefore seem prudent to really evaluate what is it that we really do need to make a digital record of. Both to make sure we're optimizing our budgets, and then the great thing is, it's a double win, because by taking that more responsible approach, we're able to significantly reduce that environmental impact that it can have. So for us, often when we talk to organizations, we say it's kind of a no-brainer. If you sit in the sustainability camp, it's ticking those boxes, absolutely. If you're sitting in the finance camp, it's ticking those boxes. We're increasing efficiencies.
So let's look at the data problem areas, but let's start with a question for you guys. How many people use ChatGPT? With a hand up? Yeah, so quite a few, me included, yeah. So every time you do a query with ChatGPT, it takes 1 pint of water to cool the system. So 1 pint of water. So in London, there is a bit of a water shortage because a lot of the servers are based here, and through all the different queries, that's causing some of the issues around water. So then how many queries do you think there are a day globally? Anyone have a guess? 100 million?
No, that's more.
It's actually 10 million. So maybe less than you thought, but 10 million queries a day. The reason I'm saying that is, you might think we're saying data centers are really bad, on-prem is really bad. We're not saying that at all. We're saying it's our data practices that we probably need to put a magnifying glass on and look at how we actually, I suppose, become more sustainable moving forward. So these are some of the problem areas that we certainly have within any organization. So we talked about dark data. So that's data that we don't really know it's there or don't really use. We've got a great case study from an automotive company we worked with recently, looking at their dark data. So they've got a production line. They produce reports of errors on the production line. They file them away, never use them again. So we decided to go through those reports and see what we can gain from them, and then digitize that. And then when a problem actually happens, we used a bit of AI, when a problem actually happens, they can type it in and it will come up with, okay, we think it's this problem. So it could be the inverter, and you can replace the fuse on the inverter, but that's not the sole problem. The other problems come further up the line. So by tapping into that dark data, they've really made a massive improvement to the efficiency of their production line.
And on that point, Tom, with that case, so they were able to utilize between 10 to 20% of their dark data. So that 10 to 20% still had value. But significantly, importantly, what remained could then be evaluated and considered for disposal. Now, of course, some of that would fall into compliance, but compliance doesn't cover all of the data that we're storing.
So if we take the store it all approach that Ian was talking about. We work with a very large organisation, and when they set up their account with a major data centre, they said use as much as you want in terms of data. Then they said in 2 years' time now, you need to throttle that back because you're going to be charged for this extra data. So as an academic institution, it's going to cost them £300,000 a year unless they throttle back on the data that's stored in the email system. So you're thinking, gosh, you know, you've got the environmental thing, so you can save on carbon, but also you can save on cost by the amount of data we're actually storing that maybe we don't really need to store. So it's all about us, really. And you can imagine we're all quite fond of our email accounts too, aren't we? And every email you send can be between 3 grams of carbon up to something like 150 grams of carbon, depends if you put attachments on and all the rest of it. But getting people to change their behaviours is always very difficult around email. I need it all. I need to store it all. And that's the same behaviour we see in all organisations. So it's changing that mindset. When it comes to information overload, following on kind of like from the email, you know, I don't know if you ever leave the office feeling, I'm absolutely knackered. Why is that? It doesn't seem to be that productive day, but I'm knackered. It's mainly because the brain can only deal with 8 to 15 tasks at any one time. And if every new email comes in is a new task, and you don't deal with it, most of us leave it in the inbox, then the brain's starting to become overloaded and it starts to become very fatigued and you're less productive. It's kind of very similar with the data. We just store on the data, we forget about it, or we're maybe thinking about it, and over time maybe people leave the organisation, then, well, what do we do with this data? Well, Mary's now left, but maybe we need it, maybe we don't need it. And you're just thinking, actually, it's poor information governance, really. We should have having the metadata information governance retention policies around that. But it's never a sexy thing to do, is it? I mean, retention policies or the rest of it's been around since, well, at least the 80s, and people still haven't really got their head round. It doesn't get the money that it deserves from the budget within the organisation to tackle that problem. But we'll come on to a real key point is the greenhouse gases protocol. And that's where I think we'll start seeing organisations freeing up some money to look at their digital data to see what needs to be done so they don't fall short of being, you know, as green as they can be when they're actually dealing with their digital platforms. Data duplication. So because we don't store our data particularly well, 20% of our time is actually spent duplicating data that already exists. Can you believe that? Now, we're never going to get that down to zero, are we? But you could probably, maybe 10% would be a good way of trying to get towards not duplicating data. And you think that in terms of cost, employee time to do that, in terms of the storage, in terms of the electricity used to actually duplicate that data that already exists, it's phenomenal. In terms of, we talked about corporate memory, when people actually leave, that's an issue because we haven't got it written down of what that data is meant to do, all the rest of it, and unstructured data. So really interesting. So you've got video, you've got music, it's all unstructured. It's very difficult for a computer to understand what's really going on. But also some of the other data that we get in, maybe from our supply chain we bring in, we think, oh, we should keep it because we need to keep it, but why are we keeping it? And you think, oh, well, that doesn't happen in our organisation. I can guarantee it happens in most organisations. Stuff comes in, we keep it because we think we need to keep it, but do we really need to? So let's look at digital carbon footprint and can we reduce it? So I talked about the greenhouse gases protocol. So I have the privilege of sitting on the World Resource Institute Technical Working Group that's looking at redefining the greenhouse gases protocol, which applied to large organisations. It hasn't been touched for a number of years, and I'm looking at scope 3. Scope 3, so scope 1 is where within your organisation, if it's a large organisation, you report on this, all your day-to-day activities, so maybe your fleet of cars, how much carbon is generated from that. Scope 2 is about where you get your electricity from. Is it from solar, is it from wind, is it from fossil fuels, etc., etc. Scope 3 was 80%. Most of your stuff goes into scope 3. So you outsource it, like all your stuff you put into the cloud, and you kind of like forget about it. That, I'm hoping, will change in 2 years' time when you'll have to report on a lot more in scope 3. And I'm hoping very much around data centres. So again, we're not blaming data centres, we're just saying we need to know our carbon footprint because at the moment it's very much hidden. We're talking a lot. Any questions so far? Yes.
This is music to my ears because it reflects a piece of research I did back in 2019.
Brilliant.
But the data duplication piece, I'm really curious with the rise of data mesh, fabric, whatever those names are going to become. To me, it feels intrinsic that we're going to create further data duplication as data becomes more decentralised. I'd be curious if this is let's put a pin in it and we'll talk about it later, or what's your thoughts about that now?
It's a really, really good question. And I suppose it all depends about the architecture, and the architecture that maybe the big providers want you to go and follow. So at the moment, they want you to put it in the cloud, don't you? It's all centralized, but do you want it centralized in the future? Does it work for your business? Is it decentralized? Is it more secure to have it decentralized, or in lots of different locations? So I guess we're still at the very beginning of this journey. We haven't talked about it yet, but there is no agreed standard to measure the carbon from digital. So we're all measuring apples and pears at the moment. So we're not there, but I think it's the community, the people like OASIS that have a big role in looking at what's going to be the impact, and will that lead to more data duplication, and how do you reduce it? I suppose this is an educational piece that you've said in 2019 you were ahead of the game, thinking, right, this is going to be an issue in the future, but it's someone like you in an organisation that raises that and go, hang on a minute, what's going to be the impact down the line? So it's a really good question, and that, unless you've got an answer, there is.
No, just to pick up on that. One thing that Tom and I have talked quite a bit about is the notion of plastic knowledge. So think about that analogy of walking on the shoreline and you see the single-use plastic washed ashore. Taking that analogy to how data is being created, that actually, so from a more of a, I suppose, a social perspective, that employees in general often don't see a problem with that notion of plastic knowledge, that, well, I need something, I'm going to identify it, find it, create it, irrespective of whether we might have something that I could use that's already within the organisation, let alone that plastic knowledge being created and then not actually shared or disseminated with anyone else in the organisation. So that awareness of its existence doesn't exist. And it is a big issue. And I think the 2 points that we've touched upon is, one, having a standard, an agreed measure will help an awful lot, just so that actually we can talk the same language. But then secondly, changing mindsets, that this isn't all, yeah, absolutely. That timeless chestnut. But I think it's more important than ever, and we've really, I think, emphasised the critical role that information and records managers play in this narrative. So often, as a function in the organisation and as a profession, it's somewhat been siloed, whereas in actual fact, it needs to be central.
Yeah. So just going back to Scope 3, this will come into play in 2 years' time. We've also got the EU AI Act as well, in terms of, think about how much compute time we use. So we're hoping more organisations start going to put a bit more money into this in terms of their thinking. Because we've had the example already, one large organisation has been told to cut down their storage, and it's going to cost them $300,000 a year. We had a large global pharmaceutical come in and said, look, our running costs are too high. We're storing all this data. We know healthcare generates 1/3 of the data in the world. It's going to cost more and more. So even if you don't get the sustainability bit, we definitely within an organisation we can change the bottom line by looking at what we store and what we don't store.
With that in mind, what Tom has mentioned, we had a paper recently published in the journal Energy Policy, and what we sought to do was, based on current trends, forecast whether global electricity supply will actually be able to cope with the energy demands of data. And interestingly, if we don't change, and if there are no new innovations, by next year, there won't be enough electricity in the world generated by renewable energy to power the demands of data. And by 2033, if you take all energy sources in the world, there won't be enough electricity to power our data demands. So we call that the data doomsday, not to put a dampener on things, but to simply flag this as it is absolutely time for change, in so much that if we don't, we are indeed facing a doomsday scenario. Now, the data industry is opaque. It's very hard to get factual information on the true costs of data. Tom and I had a debate article in Public Money and Management which raised this point about what is the cost of 1 gigabyte of data. And what you see is numerous different camps with very different views as to the cost of 1 gigabyte of data. Until we can progress to a point whereby there is a consensus, there's going to still remain a lot of resistance. This early insight is simply for transmission. The reason why we include it is simply to give a figure as to the cost of one part of the data journey. But the data journey incorporates many different steps.
Yeah, and just to add to that, we're currently on the panel for IEEE to look at building a standard, a global standard that can actually measure the carbon from digital. But you probably think, oh, it's really easy, that's kilowatt hours, but believe me, it's more complicated. People think it's really easy, but it's turned out not to be easy at all.
What question in the room?
You said that understanding of data is okay, but do you have a view for what is contributing to the data? So of all the data in the world, how much of it is Taylor Swift's tweets versus train data versus factory data versus unnecessary data versus dark data? Is anyone segmented the data, or is it just impossible to do that?
They've guessed. So we know 1/3 of the data is healthcare data, and we know that's increasing all the time because of the scans and the images that are recorded. And the next big one is financial services, because every transaction, I think, on your card generates another, is it 7 or 15 more entries, which you don't even think about, that go across the globe. In terms of social media, dare I say, I think it's relatively low compared to the big sectors. But of course, it's growing all the time, and this comes back to the original point in terms of no one really has a finger on the pulse about, because no one actually owns all the data in the world. I mean, you could go back to Sir Tim Berners-Lee and his Solid project, that we all own our own personal data, and companies have to pay for it, which would be nice, but I can't see that happening. So if anyone knows the answer to that, or it'd be great to hear. But it's just so difficult, because not only that, you know, what is that data being used for? Is it just in that sector? Is it being used across the supply chain? Is that still the same sector? And it's that double accounting that makes it can be double accounting, the same as the scope 1, 2, and 3. There's lots of double accounting there, which causes the issues.
When we think about the transition of physical records to digital, one thing that we remind organisations is the fact that it's not a single cost. There's not a single stage by which you go physical to digital. So when we have a digital record, when we have digital data, it goes through numerous stages. It's a journey that the data goes on, right from the origin through to key decisions being made with regards to its accessibility, how often it's updated, all the way through to subsequently, as Tom mentioned, what is it being used for? How is it being used? Now, I said at the beginning when we were setting the scene, imagine if you could see the zeros and ones rising from your desktop, laptop, etc. The decisions you take can increase or decrease the magnitude of that data CO2 footprint. But again, because we can't see what that intensity looks like, for many, they see no difference between whether we're incorporating data for the next most sophisticated AI model or whether we're simply using it for descriptive purposes. It's almost as though it's like a level playing field, which of course it isn't. Even with AI in of itself, there is such a range and variation between the demands of different types of AI models. So understanding this data journey is key to truly understanding what type of impact, both financial and environmental, will digital resources have. So when we think about those different considerations, we can pick a few. I'd like to zoom in a little bit on the analytics type, because human nature means that we have this tendency to want the best of everything. So AI seems to be at the forefront of every board's mind at the moment. But very few ask the question of why. Why do we need to use it? What is the benefit of using it? Now, we are absolutely not against AI. AI is transformational. But what we are for, and this is very much the message of the OECD.ai, is responsible and trustworthy use of AI is key. Our work with the National Digital Twin Programme, embedding ethics into the use of digital twins, resembles those same types of principles, that there has to be responsibility taken, that this technology isn't free of impact. Tom might want to pick up on something.
Yeah, so I'm lucky enough to be independent scientific advisor 1 day a week for the Alan Turing Institute Bridge AI program. It's all about SMEs trying to embed AI into what they do. And it's quite interesting. They come and go, we want the latest AI. And you go, well, do you really need the latest AI? And most of the time, they don't. And it's just rethinking it. And we created a data carbon scorecard some time ago, taking people through, okay, if you're going to have a new digital project, and this could work pretty much for anything, I think, start thinking about and forecasting what the costs are going to be. So the environmental costs, but also the financial costs, and do you need it all? So you think about your data sets, and you think about aggregation and disaggregation. Do you need all those columns in a spreadsheet, or do you just need a couple of them? Because if you start taking it all the way through to the AI end, it needs to compute all that, and it's computing things, those columns, it just doesn't need to be there. So it's thinking very much at the very beginning, what do we need in terms of those data sets? And normally when you work with people, they go, I want everything. And they're not really thinking at the end goal, what am I actually going to use of that? You know, a lot of the reports or lots of things it generates, 80% of the functionality is never used, it's only 20%. So it's thinking right at the very beginning, do we really need it? Then you think about the data set size. Do we need the last 20 years of data to put into the system, or can you just get away with the last 6 months? And then how frequently do we need this data to be updated? Does it need it real time? Can we do it once a month, every 6 months, for example? And then where are we going to store it? Is it going to be on-prem? Is it going to be in the cloud? And they all have impact on costs, but also sustainability. And then finally, it goes back to, we want everything to be chat GPT, that sort of technology, but do we really need it? Do we go from descriptive in terms of spreadsheets all the way up to cognitive, which is, of course, chat GPT and generative AI. So it's that thinking about, if you're moving physical records to digital, do you need them all? How are you going to, why are we moving them to digital? If we're going to move them to digital, what can we do and what can we benefit from moving it to digital? What AI could you maybe apply to it? Does it need to be AI? There's got to be thinking up front, which I think we don't always see, about why are we moving? Why are we creating this new product or new service? Why are we moving things from A to B? What's going to be the financial benefit?
So on that point, we are very much promoting a proactive approach as opposed to being reactive. So rather than going through the steps and the numerous stages and then retrospectively considering, well, what was the impact of that? to do that upfront, because it's amazing how through that process of proactive evaluation, actually you can begin to reflect, ask questions of yourself and the team and the organisation that you've never asked before, to reevaluate, maybe change your approach, still delivers on the outcome that you want, and actually you're doing it in a way that's going to have benefits with the cost base as well as benefits to the environment. When we think about broader benefits of digital decarbonisation, of course, we've talked extensively about the reduction of the carbon footprint. We have to be, more than ever, aligned to global sustainability goals. Whether we're B2B or B2C, it's an expectation, and rightly so. Digital decarbonisation is at the pioneer of embedding sustainability within digital practices. So of course, digital and sustainability have gone hand in hand for a long time. Digital technologies can be hugely beneficial, of course, but we also need to be cognizant of the dark side of our own digital practices. Absolutely cost savings. So within your own organisations, hopefully you have become and will become an advocate for digital decarbonisation. But sometimes, even though it may seem obvious as to the value of this, not everyone within an organisation will see it. So how it's pitched and how it's sold, in inverted commas, is important. And the financial gains we found often will help convince certain pockets of an organisation that might otherwise not be so interested in the sustainability side necessarily. As we're moving forward, and Thomas touched upon this, we're expecting the regulatory environment to change. Why wait for that change? Why not get ahead of the curve now? So that when that change does come, which inevitably it will in some form, you're ready, you're prepared. But there are, of course, some challenges.
Yes, so I'll maybe finish on the challenges, go and see maybe we're going to get into some questions, which is great. So there are five, I won't go through in great detail. As we said right at the very beginning, how do you measure the carbon footprint of data? So we need to get that agreed standard throughout there. We also need to hope that, I think, that we embed the impact of data on the environment into scope 3. So hopefully in 2 years' time, we'll have that through the World Resource Institute. When we share data across supply chains, that's also a potential issue because they're using different systems, interoperability, how do you get around that? And then also the data resolution. So you're getting too much data through, you're not getting enough data through to make those decisions. They're always ongoing challenges. Then it's utilizing, I suppose, dark data, but also unstructured data. How much have you got that? If I ask you now, how much unstructured data have you got in your organization, would you know? And if it's unstructured, it's potentially going to be dark data, so why have you got it there? What are you planning to do with it in the future? So doing those data audits could be really, really powerful. And then, right across, we start at the very beginning, right across the supply chain, you think about all these data, I suppose, inputs and outputs from your organization. If it's coming in, what are we doing with that data? We just keep it there because it's been given to us. But, if you think it actually comes at a cost, because we're going off the mindset that data is quite cheap to keep, but it's now starting to become a bit more expensive. So we really need to justify what data is coming in, what data is flowing out, and why we're keeping the data within the organization, be it on-prem or in the cloud.
And really, just to close, that we continue to really drive this agenda, and we're working across numerous different platforms, and we're seeing real tangible change in thinking. Several years ago, the notion of measuring the impact of data on the environment seemed like blue sky thinking. Now it's becoming a practical consideration. It's more a case of, okay, how do we do that now? If you can help us to drive this agenda forward, we'd greatly appreciate it. And we hope that there have been some interesting insights from this talk. And thank you so much for your engagement and for listening.
Super. Well, Tom, Ian, thank you very much for guiding us through just some of the highlights from the white paper that we'll shortly be publishing. I'd now like to invite David Reynolds up on stage. David is our Chief Digital Officer at OASIS, and we'll be taking a few questions both from the floor and also from our online viewers and listeners. I believe some questions have been submitted. So to the people in the room, first of all, any questions that you'd like to put to Tom or to Ian or to David? Yes, gentleman at the front.
Hi.
There's a microphone coming.
You're on, Ren.
Brilliant, brilliant. In terms of driving the agenda forward, I guess other things are getting it onto B Corp, getting it onto the more entry-level things like Good Business Charter. Do you foresee those assessment and accreditation schemes specifically embracing digital decarbonisation, perhaps once it's formally on Scope 3? And if not, how?
Do you want to
How can we all work together?
Yeah, it's a really great point. And I think that's coming, is our sense, because once we have that impetus in that wider macro environment as to, okay, this is important and you need to be doing something about it, there then becomes a sudden vacuum in terms of, oh, okay, we want to, but how? What should we do? So things like accreditation programs become critical because they become the tools to allow organisations to pick this up and go, I want to, and I know how to go about this. So we'd be super supportive of seeing that happen. And the likes of IRMS, for instance, are really championing this. So again, I'm very confident that it is coming and that there will be that type of buy-in.
Thank you.
Super. There were a couple of other questions in the room. Yes, thank you.
Hi. After my research back in 2019, I sort of coined the phrase, sustainability needs data, but data needs to be sustainable. How are you thinking about the tension that as we need to do more reporting, we need more data than ever before put under more strategic management and the rigour of financial data? So we are going to need to increase our data management costs whilst we're trying to digital decarb. I'm curious of how you think about that phrase and if there's any insights I could get from you guys.
Yeah, I love the phrase. I think it's spot on. So we've got to bear in mind, I suppose, what 65% of the data we store is dark data, and 15% is rot, so there's your 80%. So I was speaking to Ren before, I'm thinking, I'd love to put metadata onto data to see where it travels through a system, and then you can start to work out the power consumption and all the rest of it. So I think it's a small offset in terms of we need to measure it, we need to store some things, but we need to try and tackle that data waste or dark data, but also think about the data growth. So going back to Ian's point about the Internet of Things, IBM's reports, so Daniel's in the room, but over 90% of the data generated by Internet of Things sensors, so you think all the sensors out there, it's huge, is never used. So I think when people come and say about the argument, we're going to create more, we will create more data too, but then it should reduce the dark data, the redundant and obsolete and trivial data.
I think just two further points on that. So within the white paper, we present the Data Entity Audit Framework, which is a very simple matrix to help those who are maybe slightly less informed about how they could approach the auditing of their data, to have a very simple set of directions as to, okay, if data falls within this category, here's some recommendations as to what you could do. Within that, disposal of data is key, but often isn't something that is considered. Just a second point, so again, I really like that phrase, thinking about what are the minimum viable data sets, I think is really important. When we think about ESG, for instance, and that's a nice case in point as to generating lots more data in order to benefit the environment, but obviously the negative being you're generating lots more data, which has a negative impact. So what are the minimum viable data sets required? What does that even look like? So to ask that question, I think is what is quite powerful. If we've never asked that before, suddenly we're asking it, that might lead to significant change. But great question, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, in the blue jumper over here. Thank you.
Liz.
Thank you. You mentioned that the healthcare and financial kind of sectors were some of those sectors with the largest amounts of data. Do you see that the data privacy aspect could be another key challenge, that companies actually don't want to address it with the fear that things might go wrong?
I think 100%, but maybe OASIS coming on this as well. We have stories of working with a large financial organisation. They've got so much dark data, they don't want to touch it because they're fearful that there's lots of things in there that shouldn't be in there. So once you start prodding the dark data, it's like a can of worms, isn't it? But so it's a big issue. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I think from a OASIS standpoint, that's why good information governance, data retention policies, making sure that the right permissions are in place to enable data to live in one governed environment, and so actually consolidation in sensible environments that people understand. And the point around interoperability, making that available to the right systems and the right users at the right time, that's absolutely the role of a partner such as ourselves.
I think it's worth adding that there's lots of quick wins. Mm. That's what's great. That's what's great about this. There is lots of quick wins to be had here. Yeah.
Thanks, guys.
I'm just wondering whether there's any one you would point to, organisations or businesses or even countries or regions that are doing this really well, and any that are doing it really badly. Maybe leave out the name for the second one, or sectors, like who's onto this and doing it really well that other sectors can learn from.
Yeah, so bad ones are financial sector. Won't give any names, but they're pretty bad. The good ones are, there's one particular, I don't know if we can name them, but an insurance company all over it. Can we name them? I don't know.
Probably not.
Okay, but one, we can talk afterwards when it's not being recorded, but an insurance company all over it, absolutely, really forward-thinking and yeah, extremely well organised in terms of what's going to happen in the future and their carbon footprint of everything, pushing their suppliers, the data centres saying, tell me, what is my carbon footprint? I want to know. And the data centres coming back saying, oh, it's difficult. You know, we look at storage, we look at compute, oh, we don't actually measure network. Is that going to be a problem? Well, that's not your true carbon footprint, but it's a start. So afterwards, we can show you the name of the actual individual that's championing that in the insurance company.
And Tom, again, without going into who it is, but what is it about that organisation that means that, in your mind, they are taking it as seriously as they are? Is it culture? Is it leadership?
It's leadership. 100% leadership. It's come right from the very top. The individual said, look, I want to get a handle on this, and then she has employed someone to actually look at all their digital footprint and all their apps and everything across the whole business to look at what is their carbon footprint, how can they reduce it going forward. Yeah. But you're absolutely right, it's leadership.
Yeah, yeah. Critical. Okay. I think we had a couple of online questions.
One at the front here, Max.
Oh, sorry. Question here. Yes, of course, of course.
Mm-hmm. Hi there. I've got a really basic question. I used to report on ESG, and all the big global corporates would say, I understand my carbon footprint. They didn't. And I planted a tree. I bought carbon credits. It blew my mind. I'd just really be interested in your view on that and how you think we can mitigate against it.
Yeah. You love carbon credit, don't you? Because you just blow it apart.
So I think there's two interesting elements to this. And you're absolutely right. There's many organisations who their representative, whoever might be meeting, claim we are carbon neutral. Great. When we then ask, it's fascinating, so how are you capturing data within that? How are you capturing your digital practices within that? And you can see that they begin to pale. And then when you probe a little bit more, they obviously start to get a little bit whiter. So there's many organisations who are claiming to be carbon neutral, and I'm not saying that's disingenuous. From their knowledge base, they absolutely might believe that they are. So one element is helping them understand, okay, but if you haven't thought about this, then maybe you need to taper that off a little bit, that messaging, and really look at it. Things like carbon offsetting schemes absolutely have a role to play. There is value. But let's also not forget that it's finite in terms of its ability to offset all the carbon that's being generated. So I certainly would suggest that that become part of a repertoire to address an organisation's carbon footprint, but certainly cannot be relied upon. And actually that proactive approach that hopefully has come across today is really what's going to be key, because most of instances with regards to the likes of dark data, for instance, could have been addressed with a more proactive approach. So it's that shift from being retrospective, oh no, we need to plant X number of trees because of this issue. Actually, if we start from the origin and go, how can we do this better, we're going to have a much smaller, minimised footprint.
And just to follow up, to give you a figure, and I can't remember, it's 2 or 3% of GDP. That's the amount carbon offset. So if that was really true, then all the organisations, all the countries in the world could put the money in to do the carbon offset. So it really, carbon offsetting, for me, just doesn't work at all.
Thanks, Tom. Any more questions in the room, or shall we? Yes.
Sorry, just to follow up comment. Really, so the RMS is running an ESG roundtable that we've spoken about. One of the things I'd love to put on the agenda is, can we define a carbon accounting record? Is it possible? So just to flag that as something really love to talk to you more about.
Another good challenge.
Yep. Okay, a couple of questions coming in from online in that case. If we just get the mic, yep.
Thanks. So probably the first question actually is more directed at David, but the panel. You've talked about approaches to reduce carbon footprint. What technologies do you think exist now, and how do you see the role of emerging technologies in supporting reduction of carbon footprint from digital in the future?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So from an OASIS standpoint, we digitise a huge volume of clients' information from our scanning centres and then putting that through processes. So I think a large part of this is being really smart and intelligent about the problem you're solving. So don't just take that entire data set and try to digitise it on day one. So a great example of that is we have the capability to digitise millions and tens of millions of records from our investment in advanced scanners. But at the point in doing that, we can also instantly OCR it so that we don't have to do that post-process. That removes one step from the chain. We make that available to systems in an interoperable way. It means that we don't need to duplicate data in multiple environments. We also are heavily advocating the move towards consolidation into sensible environments. It's one of the key reasons why we recently launched our OASIS FileSmart, which actually has recognised the fact that a large number of our clients want to keep their environment in a Microsoft space, such as Office 365 or SharePoint. So our new technology will act as an overlay that not only allows clients to put information into those systems that they have done with us, but also bring it together in one place. I think the important point mentioned around AI is really, really pertinent because, again, we've just launched a product around contracts called Contract IQ. And the reason why I mention that is we often have clients say, what's in the box? And that's a very traditional question. And clearly, we store a huge volume of contracts for clients, and it's really difficult to answer that question. And so actually, instead of saying we will scan it for you, and we'll put it into your system over here that then subsequently needs an additional interpretation, we can actually now say, we're going to answer the question you pose to us. We're going to digitise what needs to be digitised. We're going to put it into an environment that answers the key questions of your contracts, like, is it an active contract? Who are the key signatories on this? And so actually doing that in a sensible environment means that you are not duplicating. You're only digitising the information that matters. You're adding the meta information at point of ingestion, whether we do that from a physical source or an electronic source. So from my perspective, yes, we could overlay the most advanced AI over the top of that, but it could be unnecessary. And so for me, it's really about asking clients what problems we're solving for them to bring them the right solution.
One more.
Yep, one more, sure.
I guess this one's more to the panel, actually. How can businesses balance the upfront costs of transitioning to a more sustainable digital practices with the long-term benefits of reduced carbon emissions? So how can you balance between the costs versus the carbon reduction?
I think David hit the nail on the head in terms of any future projects. So you've got legacy and future projects, haven't you? What is it you're trying to answer? And that's the key. Before you go setting off, going, we want to do everything, think about what's the financial benefit of doing what you're trying to do. Then you've got the legacy systems that, if you can get a bit of investment just to go through to see how much is dark data, how much is rot, and then do you really need it in the organisation anymore, and trying to reduce that. That will reduce your on-prem or cloud bill, as we found, with this large organisation that now has to reduce their a huge amount of data, but it's going to save them £300,000 if they can do that. So I think you can easily make a business case to go, right, we might have to do a bit of investment now, but long term, we're going to be financially better off, but also we're going to be more sustainable moving forward.
And just to add to that, certainly some of the clients that we talk to struggle to make the business case work because they're trying to make it work within the silo in which they operate. But a multi-stakeholder approach to trying to build a business case for the entire business does pay dividends when we talk to clients about expanding beyond their particular function.
Yeah, I think also short term, those quick wins we talked about often aren't very costly to engage with. It can just simply be a case of personal accountability with regards to, am I going to have an end-of-year clear-out of my files? It doesn't cost a great deal, but actually cumulatively can have a big impact. I think just second point in terms of the longer term, what we're seeing is that digital decarbonisation and that focus is becoming a key differentiator within the marketplace. That whether it be client organisations, whether it be direct consumers, are beginning to expect that awareness from the provider of the service or the product. And so we are seeing that as a real unique selling position, which has obviously long-term financial gain too.
Thanks, Ian. Another question in the blue jumper there at the back.
So I was wondering to what extent the big tech firms, the Microsofts, the Googles, are driving this versus being totally conflicted. But don't they want us to use more and more unnecessary data?
I love that question. Yeah, because it's their... Well, we've spoken to a lot of the big data centres, and they will just... If you reduce the amount of data they store and all the rest of it, they'll just change their pricing plan anyway. So you'll still be paying the same amount overall once they've reduced everyone's data. So... It is, but I guess that's where you need new startups, new data centers coming through that maybe change the business model and how they charge for data. But I think it's, like we said at the very beginning, it's the end users really. We're trying to store more and more data, but we need to store it. I feel sorry for data centers in a way because they're only providing a service. They are trying to improve their green credentials. So like in terms of storage, they're looking at glass now, so we can store data on glass in the future. They're looking at other ways of cooling the systems. So I still think it's got to come back to us. We're using that service. It's up to us how much data we put on there. It's up to us to try and change and nudge behaviours of individuals within the organisation. And then it's also up to us to try and question the big corporates. So you think about financial sector and all the data, the current methods they use. You could optimise the way, we currently tap and how many records are generated from that with a credit card or debit card. We could reduce that, but it's that willingness to do that. Because we all know when you start changing some software and all the rest of it, it can start to maybe not work and crashes and all the rest of it. So that's why they leave well alone.
And I think just to add that point about key differentiators in a fairly saturated market, it applies to those providers, the data center providers. So in terms of that ability to win more customers, clients, and to grow, how can one provider distinguish themselves from another? Well, one way to do that is to really enforce their green credentials, and we're seeing that happen more and more. So I agree that there could be a conflict, but I do think we are seeing more jumping on board with this idea because they see it has value to their prospective customers.
Yeah. Great. Another question in the room?
I don't particularly want to end on contributing to your doomsday, but the other part of this conversation is we are consuming services of a data centre, and the genie is out of the bottle. We're not going to put data back in and pretend we don't do it. But we also need to be thinking of the output of the e-waste mountain, which is growing out of control. It's the world's biggest growing problem, probably closely with the fashion industry. So we need to put our ways that we deal with our services under more scrutiny. And I think that's also part of the bigger picture is every time a cable is replaced every 3 years, because we're now making data centres a utility, they go somewhere. So we have to, even at an individual level, take ownership of how we manage our personal use of data and how we use our photos and the emails and all of this. This is across everybody to take control of. And I think today has been absolutely fantastic to raise the profile of it. This is something about everybody, however many people on the planet that are digital, can if we change our behaviour, we have the opportunity, which I think is really positive, to make a big impact. Every single person can do this.
Totally agree. You summarise that really nicely, that it's a digital ecosystem of which we're all part of, whether as an individual, whether as a representative of an organisation, but at the macro regulatory government level. And this has been one of the challenges in the sense that it is very complex. And you mentioned about e-waste. E-waste transcends all those levels, as does data waste, transcends all those levels. And for us, it's been a case of zooming in where we can to do awareness pieces, to do the education piece, but at the same time zooming back out to try and help shape and influence effectively international policy. And the more advocates we manage to have in this domain of digital decarbonisation, just the better it's going to be. So really nice comments, thank you.
Yep. Thank you, guys. Any more questions in the room or online? There's one question at the back. Thank you.
I wanted to ask, what do you think are the best ways to change behaviours overall with records management, information management? Because I work in government and quite a lot of people are working at pace and and working on quite high priority things, and they just can't be bothered to do like information management properly, or just see it as like bottom of the pile. So I was just wondering how you feel like the best ways to sort of impact individual people, or how they can make a difference. And the other question I wanted to ask is how much resource do you think would be needed for a sort of big organisation to sort of clean up storage, or sort of go about sort of undertaking a problem like this?
Take the first one and then let the panel take the second. In terms of that first point, so I'm sure you've experienced this, most organisations have. There was a big drive on paper reduction. Okay? And at the time that was introduced, we had many of the same sorts of challenges as we have now in terms of people's time, not maybe understanding, well, why am I having to reduce how much I photocopy, et cetera, et cetera. As well as things like turning off the lights and powering down our equipment. That was successful largely because of lots of nudges. Okay, and those nudges over time led to behavioural change. For me, I see something similar can occur with regards to our digital practices. One way we have sought to do this is to help individuals understand what one action equates to. So, whether it be as an organisation, we talk about if you're doing X, that equates to however many flights between London Heathrow to New York. That's one that can be done. It could simply be almost a straight energy comparison. That's like leaving the lights on for 3 billion years, whatever it might be. I think helping individuals just understand the significance of it. And for some, it will be the environmental message, and that'll be enough to get them to change or to begin that process. For others, it will simply be the awareness of, oh, wow, I just didn't appreciate the actual cost of this. And in the current environment that we're in, particularly within the public sector, cost has always been important, of course. It's very much back in the spotlight. Some of this is, again, quick wins. We can reduce our cost base by doing X, Y, and Z. And that's beneficial for everybody.
I must say I agree, and listening to the examples that you gave earlier on in your talk in terms of an email being anywhere between 3 grams and 150 grams of carbon. Every chat GPT session is a pint of water. I think those are the things that can really help people to understand the impact of their digital behaviours on the sustainability agenda. So I think that nudge behaviour, I understand the paradox of sending an email to explain this to people. We'll have to find other ways to do it. But definitely those understanding your own personal contribution to the data, to the digital decarbonisation, I think is important.
And then you might have an idea with regards to the cost question.
Not necessarily directly touching on the cost, but definitely looking at the landscape of information that you hold with your own organisation, whether that be directly or indirectly through vendors. I think just having an understanding of the value of that data, and you can do some pretty high-level assessments on that to really start to enforce some data retention rules. You may have information that has been lying around for 20 years that is not valuable. And so actually, I know it's very difficult to sometimes make some of those decisions, but that's one of the benefits of working with an organisation like OASIS. At every point in which we ingest information, whether that be the traditional box in a record centre, the meta information around that, you can help us in identifying whether or not that has future value. And then from a digital standpoint, at the point of digitising assets, sometimes you need to digitise to ask some of these hard questions, but that's more beneficial to do that now than maybe waiting 20 years. I don't know if you have a view on that piece.
I just think OASIS is a good example here because you can look at your legacy stuff, but also your future stuff. So the legacy stuff, you kind of like, okay, we're going to ingest this, but why are we ingesting this? All the way through to we're going to set up a new system in the future, but why are we setting up that new system and what's the carbon footprint of that going to be? Or if you don't like the carbon footprint argument, what's the cost going to be now, but also maybe 6 months' time, a year time, 2 years' time. And I think you can also add gamification into it too. So we're working with one organisation now, we're pitting departments against departments in terms of their carbon footprint and their spend. And they start with this, like, oh, that's not fair because we send all these large images and all the rest of it. You go, okay, there might be a case for that. So we try to normalise it so then it's a fair playing field to play on. But yeah, interesting.
I guess I'd just add one more point, which is when you do recognise, and I know some government departments and some NHS trusts that we work with, they will get to a point where they say, we've got that information, we have to hold this for regulatory reasons. Okay, can we be more intelligent about how we hold that? Yeah. If that is cold storage and you want it digitally cold storage, do you necessarily need a application that's really rich that in its own right is potentially impacting us here? Or could it be actually moved to a very cold state? And again, it's making those decisions so that you're not putting that information into the core systems that you're using every day.
Sorry, me again. There's two things with that. Is that the first one, gamifying people understanding the carbon about what they're doing is music to my ears, because as soon as somebody's arguing with you, they're getting the point of the data and they're getting the point of the exercise. And that, I think, is really an exciting tipping point. And I think when you were saying about the how you store it, I've had conversations with clients going, but if your main servers, even on-prem, are in the hottest room in the building, that's really not energy efficient because you're working very hard to cool it. It's, again, this has been a fantastic session because I feel like I've got more people in a tribe that, you know, those advocates, that's all great. Because it is the long approach of getting people to think beyond their silo. And I think that's what's really important is that, and I'll go back to it, everybody is a data person and everybody needs to be a sustainability person. And they're the two things that I think we need to nudge that behaviour and find ways to change it.
Thank you. Great. Well, look, thank you very much to the panel for answering those questions. Thank you also, obviously, to Ian and to Tom for a fantastic, thought-provoking piece of research, which we are releasing today on the website. Thank you to the audience in the room for your questions, for your attention, also to those of you who followed online. And just to leave you with a thought from a comment from one of our speakers today, I think it is time that we do create that movement around embedding sustainability in digital practice. And I think there's a lot more that we can do on that front, and we need to do on that front. So great to be helping with that, and I look forward to more fruitful discussions on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.